Hello and welcome to DROIX. Today we are checking out the brand new AAA Next Windows gaming handheld. We will be unboxing it, comparing it to the previous model and looking at its new features. We will then put it through its paces with some system and gaming benchmarks, followed by some gameplay and emulator tests. The AAA Next Advance comes in some fancy packaging. It's very premium looking and easily one of the best boxes we have reviewed so far. First, we have a bunch of quick start guides which show all the device's functions. There's an overlay which details some of the improvements, such as the Hall effect joysticks found on this model. And here is the... Right, who's nicked the AAA again? And here's the AAA Next. We will take a closer look at it shortly. Next we have the charger, which has a USB Type A and Type C ports. It has US power pins, but there's also European, UK and Southeast Asian adapters in the box. There's a USB Type C cable for the charger. And last but not least, there are two USB Type-C to Type-A adapters, which is handy as there's no Type-A ports on the device. The AAA Next measures around 10.5 by 4.4 by 1.18 inches at its largest points and weighs 720 grams. It has a 7-inch IPS multi-touch screen and runs at 1280 by 800 resolution. On the front are left-clickable analog stick and D-pad. There's two buttons below which are View and Menu, aka Select and Start. On the right side are four gaming buttons and the right clickable analog stick. Below is a custom button which you can define in ISpace, and the IA key which brings up ISpace software. See our separate video on ISpace if you want to learn more about it. On the top you have the left and right shoulder and trigger buttons. There is the power button which doubles as a fingerprint sensor for fast logging into Windows. Next to that are volume up and down buttons, followed by a 3.5mm headphone jack. And there's a USB Type-C port which can be used for charging or data. On the bottom is a second USB Type-C port which can also be used for charging or data. On either side are stereo speakers. Both the analog joysticks and trigger buttons are using Hall effect sensors. Instead of traditional button type activation, they use magnets which detect activation through a magnetic field. It provides more accurate input and also less wear and tear on the parts. The AAA is also the first handheld to use them, which is great to see. The model we are reviewing is the AAA Next Advance, which is a limited edition version. It has the AMD Ryzen 7 5800U processor with 8 cores and 16 threads, and for graphics it's running the AMD Radeon Vega 8. The AAA Next and Pro models will have the 5825U processor, which is likely to have a small increase in performance. Inside you can find 16 gigs of LPDDR4x RAM and 2TB of NVMe SSD. It is powered by three 4100 mAh batteries. In our tests we got 5 to 6 hours on idle and 1.5 to 2 hours whilst running Street Fighter V benchmark on loop for maximum load. For fan noise we measured around 55 decibels in an average office noise environment. We kick off the system benchmarks with PassMark, which tests the performance of the CPU, GPU, RAM and storage by pushing them to their maximum. Running at 20 watts TDP we get a score of 5469. That's great scores for CPU and GPU, around the average area for graphics, and excellent scores for SSD performance. PCMark benchmarks a task you may be doing whilst not gaming. These can include web browsing, working with Office documents, and even some video and image processing. Running at 20 watts TDP, we get a very impressive score of 6118. It's the highest we have had on a handheld, and not far from the highest of all the products we have reviewed, which includes mini PCs. For 3D Mark, we are testing on a 4K display and resolution with TDPs at 11, 20 and 32 watts. This gives an indication of the performance, but also the difference in how much changing TDP makes for CPU and GPU. At 11 watts we get 1139, 1428 at 20 watts, and an increase of just 43 at 32 watts. We can see here that increasing the TDP beyond 20 or so is not a worthwhile improvement. We are running Forza Horizon 5 at 1280 by 800 on the very low graphic settings. We saw with Horizon 4 that the AMD obliterated the Intel processor handhelds. Will it be the same for Forza Horizon 5? At 11 watts TDP we get 60 frames per second, at 20 we get 80, and at 32 we get 84 frames per second. They are all excellent scores and far higher than the Intel based ONEXPLAYER series, for example. At 20 watts TDP with some graphics tweaking, you can enjoy 30 frames per second at mostly high graphics settings with 1 or 2 ultra settings. Or if you prefer 60 frames per second, you can have a mix of low and medium settings. Either way, the game runs amazingly well. We are running Street Fighter V at 1920 by 1080 on the maximum graphic settings. We get the average frames per second at the end of the first match. At 11 watts TDP we get 26.81, 32.61 on 20 watts, and at 32 watts we get 33.95. For the Final Fantasy XIV benchmark we are running at 1920 by 1200 on the maximum graphic settings. At 11 watts TDP we got 2458, 20 watts we got 3038, and 32 watts we got 3158. Again, we can see the 32 watts TDP does not make a massive difference in performance compared to the 20 watts. They are not amazing scores when compared to the Intel processors, which generally do better in this test. Next, we are benchmarking Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1280 by 800 on the lowest graphic settings. At 11 watts we get a respectable 47 FPS, and we get a great increase to 60 frames per second at 20 watts. At 32 watts TDP we get a small increase of just 3, which makes it 63. Tomb Raider is a demanding game, but it should be mostly playable on 20 watts TDP. Or you could knock it down to 30 frames per second and make some tweaks to the graphics if you want something nicer. Here is a recap of the benchmark results for 11, 20 and 32 watts TDP. Overall the scores are great, with excellent scores for PCMark and Forza Horizon 5 in particular. We can see that changing the TDP from 11 to 12 watts makes a big difference in performance, while 20 to 32 watts makes very little difference in comparison. The sweet spot seems to be around 25, but honestly you could save a bit of power and leave it on 20 and not notice any difference in performance. And next we compare the Neo Next with the recently reviewed ONEXPLAYER Mini. We are showing the results for 20 watts TDP, and for the highest TDP it's 35 watts on the ONEXPLAYER Mini and 32 watts on the Neo Next. There is a small difference in power, but as the IA's TDP does not scale up well after 20 watts, it's not a major difference. It's here where we can see the ONEXPLAYER TDP scales up far nicer than the IA. We can get performance increases from 10 to 16% compared to around 6% on the IA Neo. There's no real winner who is the fastest. Both Intel and AMD have games where they excel at, and others where they are comparatively lower performance. And now onto some gameplay footage. Instead of pushing everything to the maximum, we are running at mostly playable settings. Here we are playing Halo Infinite at 20 watts with 1280 by 800 resolution. We have set it to the default low graphics settings with a minimum and maximum frame rate of 30 and 60 respectively. We don't get solid 60 FPS, it's more in the mid 30s to mid 40s area, but the game is still very playable. For Doom Eternal, we are using the default high graphics settings at 1280 by 800 with 20 watts TDP. We get a very stable 30 frames per second. You can increase some graphics settings higher if you wanted to, but these are fine. Unravel plays very well. We're running at 1280 by 800 with the highest graphics settings. We get a solid 60 frames per second at 20 watts, and you could lower the TDP a little if you wanted to, and it should still be fine. Streets of Rage 4 runs just fine as you would expect. You can play at 1280 by 800 with ultra graphics settings and get a solid 60 FPS. You can change the TDP to 11 watts and still keep at 60. It's a great game if you want to save some battery life. The Neo Next is more than capable of running all the classic games consoles and computers, so we won't waste time showing them in this video. You will have no issues with everything up to Dreamcast, PlayStation 1, PSP, etc. We will be taking a look at a few of the more recent consoles and emulators in development. We start off with the Xbox OG emulator Xemu. We tried a bunch of games, and as long as they were compatible with the emulator, they ran very well. Calibur 2 runs at a solid 60 frames per second. Depending on the game, you may be able to set the rendering resolution to 2 times to improve the graphics quality. Overall, Xbox OG emulation is great. Next, we are trying OutRun Coast to Coast on PCSX2. I tried a few random games and had no issues with performance at 20 watts TDP. On most games, you can either decrease the TDP to save battery or bump up the internal resolution to 720p with some filtering to improve the graphics. Depending on the game, you might even be able to get away with 1080p resolution. You shouldn't have any issues with PS2 at all. PlayStation 3 very much depends on the game you're playing, whether or not you will get good results. Wipeout HD is ranging from 30 to mid 50s frame rates. You could lock the frame rate to 30, but it felt a bit slow for me. Less demanding games such as DuckTales will run no problem at 60 frames per second. Onto the Xbox 360 now. Halo 3 is offering around the mid 20s to 30s frame rate for most of the game. For me, it's not very playable. Increasing the TDP to 32 watts does improve it a little. You may have better luck with less demanding games or XBLA titles. We are trying the Yuzu emulator, and performance can vary between games. That's even if they are compatible. The emulator is in active development, so things change often. Cruis'n Blast is blasting along at a mostly solid 60 FPS. You may see some dips now and again when the shaders are generating. Urban Troll Playground runs pretty well. It's playable, but we are getting FPS in the 40s to 50s area with some occasional stutters. First party titles also run very well. We went karting and enjoyed frame rates at mostly 55 to 60 frames per second. It's very impressive, but remember, not every game will run perfect. Overall, the Xenia Next performs amazingly well. It has one of our highest scoring benchmarks for PCMark, which is very impressive for a handheld. For gaming, it's great, but compared to the Intel-based devices, you will see some difference in performance depending on the game. AMD and Intel fans can fight it out in the comments. For emulation, the Next is again very impressive. Retro gaming fans will have no issues at all whilst playing the classic consoles and computers from Atari 2600 to the Dreamcast. We would expect nothing less from this handheld. As we get into more recent consoles, the Xenia performs very well. We can now enjoy Xbox and PlayStation 2 games running great at full speed with graphics enhancements used. This extends to the DROIX emulator, with games ranging from playable speeds up to full 60 frames per second. The Xenia Next is very comfortable to hold for extended periods of time whilst gaming. It's just the right size for the screen being easy to see while still making it portable. What we also appreciate is the presentation from Xenia, starting from the packaging content and innovations in each model, and not forgetting the iOS-based software, which makes it feel like a gaming handheld rather than a Windows PC. I will leave the decision as to what handheld you should buy out of Intel or AMD, but you can be assured that with the Xenia Next you definitely won't be disappointed. That wraps up our review of the Xenia Next. We hope you have found it useful. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest gadget videos. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you back in the next one.